Let me introduce, I'm Mike Stafford. I'm a volunteer with the North Country Trail Association, and in particular the Heritage Chapter of the North Country Trail here in Wisconsin. How many are familiar with it or have already hiked on the trail? So we have a few people that already know about it. Just to give you an overview, if you haven't picked up some of the literature in the back, we've got lots of it. But one of the brochures that you're for sure going to want to have is this one on the North Country Trail. And in here, it just shows you the expanse of this trail, 4,600 miles from New York to North Dakota. This is our logo, so it's hard to get that logo on a lot of things. But before we get started too far, our little group here is pretty much talking about Wisconsin, about 220 miles of trail. If you're going east to west, you come in early and you go out at Superior. And so what I'd like to do is just introduce you a little bit and then turn you over to somebody else who will probably turn you back to me. But just to give you an idea of the organization, we work a lot with the North Country Trail Association. Is a nonprofit organization that largely works to promote and protect and build and maintain the trail itself. And so that's done largely with volunteers, but we can't do it alone. We need the support of the National Park Service, and of course this is a national designated trail. It's designated by Congress. It's approved and authorized, and its route is kind of set by law. And you're going to find out a little bit more about that. And then as we get into the program, you'll find out a little bit more about Wisconsin itself. What I always like to tell people, Wisconsin gave the North Country Trail its name because there was a North Country Trail in the Schwamigan Forest before there was a National North Country Trail. And so that's kind of the naming of it, I think. Maybe I'm wrong. Tom will tell you. But I'd like to introduce you to Tom Gilbert. He's a former superintendent, retired superintendent of the National Park Service of both Ice Age, so the Ice Age Trail and the North Country Trail here in Madison. And then I'll introduce you to as I get back into it, I'll introduce you to some of the other cohorts of mine. So Tom, would you do the honors?
Okay.
Take your seat.
You may. You saw the pretty pictures, and that's the best part, you know. The land and the volunteers that make it all happen. I had the privilege of working for the National Park Service and spent most of my career working on the North Country Trail, starting way back in the 1970s when it was still a proposed trail, and the twists and turns of my career just kept bringing me back in touch with it, and I had a wonderful job that I'm glad you all paid me to do. I had a lot of fun doing it. I think it was important work, and we had a good group of people, and it's passed on to some others now. But you've seen the map of the trail. I don't know.
I heard the thing.
That's what it did before, so
okay.
You're ready to go?
I am. There we go. To say that the North Country National Scenic Trail is one of 11 national scenic trails. For many years there was only 8. A few years ago Congress authorized 3 more national scenic trails, and the North Country Trail was the 4th national scenic trail created by Congress. And 6 of them are administered by the National Park Service, 5 of them by the U.S. Forest Service. The law provides that when a large portion of the trail lies on national forest lands, that the Secretary of the Interior and in turn the U.S. Forest Service is likely to be the administrator. So the National Park Service has the privilege of working on those trails that span a lot of distance not on public lands. And so it's very, very challenging. Go ahead, Bill. If you're not familiar, the National Trail System Act was passed in 1968. The same day in Congress, they passed two important pieces of legislation, the National Trail System Act and the National Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And they are consecutively numbered bills or acts of Congress. Go ahead, Bill. The National Trail System Act immediately designated two existing long-distance trails, the Appalachian and the Pacific Crest Trail, as the first two national scenic trails. But it authorized 14 other routes to be studied as potential national scenic trails, and one of those 14 was the North Country National Scenic Trail, described as extending from the Appalachian Trail in Vermont to the Lewis and Clark Trail in North Dakota. Some people look at the trail and say, why are those endpoints there? They actually connected two trails, and then at the last minute, Vermont was lopped off, but I'll say a word or two about that later on. So when Congress authorized the trail, it only went from New York. Next slide. The National Trail System has 4 categories of trails that are authorized or designated underneath it. One is the National Scenic Trail, kind of the backbone of the whole system, and it was really the vision of creating a national trail system when legislation was first being conceived. It didn't get a lot of support early on because where are most of our representatives? They represent the large urban masses of people. And they kind of said, what's in it for us? All these remote trails, they're not near where my constituents live. And so they created another category called National Recreation Trails, which provides for designation as part of the system, shorter trails that are predominantly in urban areas, but also in national park and forest areas. And so that category was in there. And then there was a category called Connecting and Side Trails that provide access to features off the trails, connections between the trails, and so forth. And then when we were doing the studies of those 14 routes in the 1960s and 1970s, a lot of those 14 routes that were stated in the original act to be studied were things like the Santa Fe Trail, the Oregon Trail, the Lewis and Clark Trail, historic routes. And as we did the studies, because those went west through the mountain passes that interstate highways take today, we were coming to conclusions that maybe it's not feasible to establish Appalachian-like trails along these routes. The interstates follow the way the wagons went, because it was the best route then, and it's still the best route. Well, somebody said, you know, these routes are so important to the history of our country, we should do something with them. And so a few years are spent thinking about that and coming up with the concept of a National Historic Trail. And the intent for National Historic Trails is that we aren't going to create a walkable trail along their entire length. But we are going to try and identify them, protect them as much as we can, although they go across a lot of private land as well, to do some marking and provide interpretive signs along these. And that is what we're doing with historic trails today. And I had the privilege also for 17 years, in addition to the Ice Age and North Country Trails, I was also the superintendent of the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail. So I learned a lot of Lewis and Clark history, which was fascinating. And there, you know, if you ask, well, what was their trail route? Well, they were on the water most of the time. So where do you put the trail? You know, which riverbank? I don't know, whatever. So anyway, that's our National Historic Trails. There are 19 National Historic Trails compared to the 11 National Scenic Trails. And there are constantly others that are coming up and being considered. So let me tell you a little bit of the background of how the North Country Trail came about.
Next slide.
Yeah. And, oh my goodness, did I grab the wrong set of papers? Nope. I want to tell you that Wisconsin here has a real important connection to the whole National Trail system. Because Gaylord Nelson was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1962. He showed up, I And shortly thereafter, some of the key leaders from the Appalachian Trail community dropped in on him. And they said, we're losing parts of our trail. We heard that you're a real environmental-oriented person. We need, because of its multi-state dimension, we need federal-level protection that spans the state boundaries to help protect what we've got here. Because we're starting to lose it as people were creating second home sites up in the Appalachian Mountains and dividing up the land. Big landowners had let the trail go across. The little landowners are going to build their home on it. We don't want the trail on our property. So they were losing it. So he was a sympathetic ear. And about the same time, this Outdoor Recreation Resources Review Commission completed its work, recommended a nationwide system of trails. And in 1964, the Interior Department started a study and follow-up of the need for trails nationwide. Signed that to the Bureau of Outdoor Recreation. All the federal agencies were directed to provide input, and one of the things that the U.S. Forest Service provided as part of their input to this study was this idea of a North Country National Scenic Trail to basically link up their national forests in the northern tier of states from Vermont to North Dakota. And that was included in the final report that came out in 1966 called Trails for America. It was listed as one of the potential national scenic trails. Well, Gaylord Nelson in 1967 was approached by the administration and said, you know, you got your bill in Congress that he had introduced. You know, would you introduce, you know, set yours aside and introduce the bill that captures this structure of a national trail system that was in this Trails for America report. And he agreed to do that, introduced the bill, and it was passed in 1968. In 1971, the federal agency started the study of the North Country Trail. In 1973, they had public meetings with a draft report, and it was pretty well accepted, and people felt it should go forward, be authorized by Congress. And then the Bureau got a letter from the governor of Vermont saying, we don't want the Vermont portion of the trail included in it. And so the Secretary of the Interior agreed to this, and Vermont was dropped from the proposal in the final report. Between 1975 and 1980, when Congress finally authorized the trail, there were several bills introduced in Congress. None of them went anywhere beyond committee, as far as I know. In 1980, they did pass a law because, anybody watch David Letterman last night? Okay, I guess I'm the only culturally. Well, he had President Jimmy Carter on last night. And President Carter, you remember when presidents used to do an environmental message each year to Congress? They don't do that anymore. In his Carter's 1979 message to Congress on the environment, he called for Congress to enact legislation to create the North Country National Scenic Trail. Congress did. So we can be thankful for that. In 1981, the North Country Trail Association formed out.
You got another slide?
I think I did go to 19, yes. The North Country Trail Association was organized. That was very good because we at the federal level knew that the Appalachian Trail wouldn't exist without volunteers and a strong volunteer organization to really do all this work and get support and enthusiasm going. And that started in Michigan in 1981. In 1982, we finished up in the National Park Service the comprehensive plan for the trail. Then I've thrown down just a few other dates. In 1983, we established the operation from the National Park Service office in Omaha. It was not exactly on the trail. The Park Service was still trying to figure out what its role was and how it was going to care for these long, skinny national parks with lots of boundary and very little land. And what's more, Congress said in 1980 when they authorized it, you federal agencies may not spend any money to buy any land for the trail. That's a bit of a challenge. If we can't buy any land for the trail, we got a lot of private land across. That's been a challenge over the years. Congress still has not appropriated, I think, any money to buy any land. But they have given us authority, which I'll just touch on briefly in a moment. In 1990, they moved the operation of the trails out of Omaha to Madison, Wisconsin, and I moved with it. And I came here from Omaha. In 2009, Congress finally passed some legislation that gave us authority to buy land, but only from willing sellers. The Appalachian Trail always had eminent domain authority to make sure they could get the land that they needed for the trail. There's only a couple of trails that have that. Now most of them have this willing seller authority, so we cannot condemn any land. I say we, I don't work for the Park Service anymore, but I kind of get in that mode of speaking. Retired 3 years ago. In 2012, they ended up deciding to split the Ice Age and North Country Trail operations, which several of us had been recommending for quite a while. And the new superintendent that they hired, they located in Lowell, Michigan, to start up an office there, which is good because that's the headquarters of the North Country Trail Association. And if you know anything about anybody hike the Appalachian Trail? You go through Harpers Ferry, West Virginia? Yeah. That's where both the Appalachian Trail Conservancy now and the National Park Service office are located in the same city. Makes for good coordination, makes sense. So finally we have the North Country Trail operation of both the Park Service and the North Country Trail Association in Lowell, Michigan. And my last thing there is saying extension to the Appalachian Trail in Vermont is authorized with a question mark. We kept that hope alive over the years, and we talked with the Green Mountain Club. Green Mountain Club, thank you, in Vermont, who was the one that had prevailed upon the governor of Vermont to not allow the trail in Vermont. Well, players have changed. They're more amenable to it. And I and a representative of the North Country Trail Association made a presentation to them at their annual meeting in 2007, and they said, we're willing to reconsider it. And so the Park Service and the local organization in Vermont, as well as the North Country Trail Association, we cooperated and did a feasibility study about finding a connection and reigniting that in Vermont. Next slide, Bill. Probably going too slow. I want to point out three things, well, two things really. The first one, in the opening part of the act, it emphasizes the importance of doing this with volunteers and the cooperation of many, many parties. And so while the Park Service may be the administrator of the trail, when it started out it was just me for 3 trails. And when I retired, we had 10 people for 2 trails. So again, we're not out building and maintaining the trail. We're trying to provide and facilitate the efforts of many, many partners. And that's in keeping with the philosophy of the National Trail System. The other one down here is the important aspect that, again, it's a cooperative effort. And in carrying out the work, all of the parties need to consult with one another and cooperate, because we involve a lot of different parties in the route of the trail, public and private, and we are directed to coordinate with them. Next slide, Bill. Those are the 2 principal trail organizations. We work with all the departments of natural resources and along the trail and local communities, county park agencies, you name it. Next slide, Bill. Just tell you briefly what the National Park Service does in their role, and I don't know what their staff complement is now, probably about 3.5 or 4 people maybe. Yeah. They're responsible for selecting the route of the trail. That's specified in the law that the Secretary of the Interior, acting through the Park Service, selects the route of the trail. So any planning that is done, we're involved in that, or we lead it. Park Service. Can't get out of the we mode. In 2009, as I said, we finally got, the Park Service finally got land acquisition authority. But that's if funds are appropriated for the purpose, and no funds have been appropriated yet for that purpose. So it's being considered, but you know, it's a tight financial time. From the budget that we do have, which is not for land acquisition, we provide a lot of financial assistance to partners to support their organizations and their efforts, as well as specific trail projects. Next slide. We have a role of ensuring that other public projects take the trail into account. And so if there's a highway project, we may work with the highway agency to make sure that if the trail has to cross a new freeway, that there's a bridge provided for it, or some safe passage. Some of you may recognize that picture. It's not on the North Country Trail, that's just north of here on the Ice Age Trail, US 12, going north. The famous Ice Age Trail bridge to nowhere.
They're gonna add trail to that this year.
They just bought the land.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Where that bridge is.
It will no longer be the bridge to
It won't
nowhere.
be the bridge to nowhere, and some. One of the Eagle Scouts in my scout troop is doing a project on the land to create some of that trail. He's doing a punch-and boardwalk on some wet area on the land. So eventually, it's finally going to be used. The Park Service does its best to provide tools and materials for the volunteers and the projects that they carry out on the trail. We provide training for the volunteers, not only in trail building techniques, state-of-the-art sustainable trail building, and Bill Menke here is one of the masters of that that I have known over the years. Also provide safety training for use of chainsaws, make sure they have the proper equipment, no safe way to do it. Last slide, Bill. We provide interpretive displays or cooperate with others in providing interpretive panels along the trail. We have, or the Park Service has the brochure, standard brochure. You can't hike from that, but it's a good overview of the trail, and we provide that. And by law, the administering agency, the Park Service, has to provide the trail signs and markers for all the cooperators along the trail. So I'm sure I probably talked longer than I should have, but that's how it came about, and tells you about the role of the federal partner. So I'll turn it back to you, Mike. Probably
Thanks,
take
Don.
questions at the end.